It's my absolute honour and privilege to introduce Professor Christine Patch. Chris is the Principal Genetic Counsellor in my group in Engagement in Society at Wellcome Connecting Science, and also she was the lead genetic counsellor at Genomics England. She's also led the team of genetic counsellors at Guy's Hospital in the UK, and previous to that worked at PhD Foundation and also at Southampton. I'd say that Chris is probably one of the grandmothers of genetic counselling in the UK. She's a very experienced genetic counsellor. She's someone that we all turn to for advice and wisdom about anything to do with genetic counselling, whether it's practice, policy, education, or really just mentorship and support. She's going to be delivering a lecture on the development of genetic counselling in the UK, and this is based around some work that she's been doing over the last 6 months, interviewing key genetic counsellors across the UK who were instrumental in developing the profession of genetic counselling across the UK. And Chris was very much part of that journey of developing the profession. And it's wonderful that she has been the one that's been spearheading the conversations around practice, policy, and then ultimately registration and regulation of genetic counsellors. So I'm going to hand over to Chris for her keynote lecture and the film that she has around the interviews with genetic counsellors in the UK.
So as you see from the programme, I'm Christine Patch, and I'm going to be coming to talk to you about the development of genetic counselling as a profession in the UK. This is a rather unusual keynote lecture because it is predominantly a film. As the genetic counsellor profession is maturing internationally, we wanted to collect some recollections from colleagues in the UK, people that have been involved in the early stages of the development of the profession and people that are involved now. So we were planning this at the end of 2018, 2019, and basically I was hoping to be visiting old colleagues, having cups of tea and doing a bit of filming. But then, of course, the pandemic came. So we have done most of this over Zoom. The individual films will be held on the Society and Engagement website. And we have started to pull these together into a short film. This is the first time it's been shown to a wider audience. So it's really a premiere. But I have to tell you that it might undergo some more tweaks as well in the future. So thank you to Lauren, Angela, Emma, and the Society and Engagement team at the Genome Campus for making this happen. The people in the film you will see are just a very small number of all the individuals who have worked so hard for the profession over the years. We're having conversations, we're telling stories, we're talking about the past and sharing memories. It's just a start, and I hope you enjoy the film and the discussion afterwards. So thank you very much. The evolution of genetic counselling in the UK was really down to a group of people who happened to be at the right place, at the right time, at the beginning of genomic services in the National Health Service. In the late 1980s, when I started in genetics, there was a very small group of people, mostly nurses. We worked in clinical genetics services, which had started to be funded centrally by the NHS.
Back in the dawn of time, an advert came out for a specialist nurse in genetics in Nottingham, in a clinical genetics service within the NHS. I'd done a diploma in nursing which included some genetics, and I was quite interested in that. And I was very inspired by the people I met there, a small team of people who came over as really enthusiastic and motivated to deliver a patient-focused service. I was so inspired by the people I met that I thought, right, I'll go for it, and I got the post. So that was in 1983. I didn't really know what the job was. Well, at that time I really knew very little about what else was going on in the country. Were there other people like me in posts? And I discovered, well, yes, there were, but very few.
I was the only genetic nurse that was appointed to work in Somerset. We did a lot of home visits. We were sent out, to gather information from people rather than give them a lot of genetic information at that time. But still, once you were sitting in someone's living room, they didn't stop asking you questions, but the broader genetics was really fairly new to me. It was exciting and scary and also a bit isolated. I didn't know any other genetic nurses.
I came into genetics in 1988 because I needed a job, and I happened to meet an old friend at a party who was the genetic counsellor at Guy's, and I said I needed a job, and she said, well, we need person number 2. She decided to leave shortly after I got there. I don't think there was a link. She told me there wasn't a link. But genetic counselling, primarily, that I was involved with was seeing geneticists. And they tended to get me to come and sit with them if they thought that the news they were about to give or the situation required some kind of follow-up. One of the things I was very aware of was the fact that I knew nothing about genetics. Even though I could wing it because of being a nice nurse.
I was studying what was the very beginnings of molecular biology at the University of California in San Diego. And I met in my second year, a woman who had come back to visit friends. And I just met her by chance because I was out somewhere. I think we were having pizza somewhere, and she knew someone I was with. She was in the first year of the genetic counselling course at Berkeley, and she started describing it, and it just was like a light bulb. Clinical genetics was in its, sort of nascent and very small.
By the early 1990s, an organisation had been formed called the Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association, GNASWA, which doesn't mean a lot to most people.
There was an insight right at the beginning that this wasn't nursing in the traditional way, that they formed a professional group from a long time ago.
There was no kind of framework within which we worked. A number of us felt that we should formalise, and out of that evolved the Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association.
They decided they needed some bylaws, and nobody kind of knew how to write bylaws, so one of the people whose husband I think was in the sailing club got his bylaws from the sailing club, and they almost just crossed out sailing and put genetic nursing. By the time they had bylaws, there was 10 people, 9 nurses and 1 social worker, so they decided to call it the Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association.
I don't think people probably know now, apart from old people like you and I, what the GNSWA were, because I don't think I ever met a social worker.
I don't like disorganisation, so quite soon I actually chaired that group.
I met Penny Gilbert. GNSWA, as it was at the time, had a little satellite meeting, and I went along. By the end of the meeting, I found that Penny was nominating me to be on the committee. I hadn't really been asked, and suddenly Penny said, I nominate Heather Skirton, and it was like...
Yeah, I think if someone believes in you, you start to believe in yourself. When I think about my professional role, I consider I was an enabler.
They knew that this was a new role, and they wanted to start thinking about what was needed for the people doing them to be safe and effective practitioners. The title genetic counsellor was not in common use.
I think all the Birmingham people called themselves genetic associate, and then there were others who called themselves genetic nurses or genetic counsellors, or there was another term, wasn't there, that people used? I can't remember what it was now.
Even so, the numbers of people in practice were expanding. It became clear that some kind of formal education pathway was needed. In the US, there were already established programs for training of genetic counsellors at master's level. And by chance, an early graduate of one of these programs moved to the UK.
I was going to start with Lauren Curzon-Storer.
Lauren Curzon-Storer.
Lauren Curzon-Storer.
Lauren, particularly.
Lauren Curzon-Storer.
Lauren set up the first master's in genetic counselling in the UK, and actually was the first one in Europe.
That input changed genetic counselling in the UK.
I moved to the UK permanently in 1979. I think it was colleagues in Manchester who pushed quite a lot and said, we should be doing this here. I think I was a little bit apprehensive. I mean, partly just daunting because I was still relatively young. Well, not relatively young, I was young. And also, most importantly, I had a really strong view from the beginning that you don't take on students if people wouldn't have jobs at the end of it.
The Masters in Genetic Counselling, which did mirror the training that she had got and others had got in the States.
So I did write the full curriculum, and it was very much based on the curriculum that I had at the University of California, Berkeley. The course there was very much known for a really large psychosocial orientation. I transported that basically. And so we launched in 1992. And something really crucial in that launch was the fact that Chris Barnes made a brave move to enroll on that course. So Chris, as we all know, was an experienced genetic counsellor. Actually was one of the few people who called herself a genetic counsellor in those days.
I got a place on the first MSc genetic counselling course in Manchester. There were 4 on the first cohort. I was the only person working. The other 3 were science graduates, 2 of whom are senior genetic counsellors now in the UK profession. I loved the fact that we got proper genetic lectures.
I applied to do the master's programme in Manchester and got into the second year.
That was my first introduction to genetic counselling.
Okay.
I was in one of the first years of the master's programme in Manchester. It did all start with that first MSc course.
In 2000, the second programme was set up in Cardiff. By the mid-1990s, graduates were coming out of these programmes. Genetic medicine was also expanding. The formation of the British Society of Human Genetics incorporated GNASWA. This led us to changing the name of the society to the Association of Genetic Nurses and Counsellors.
I think one of the motivations was we couldn't stand John Byrne making fun of us anymore. Because at every BSHG council meeting he would sort of say, this GNASWA or whatever you are. It was Genetic Nurses and Social Workers Association, to acknowledge the 2 professional groups within the association. We increasingly felt that wasn't appropriate. For a start, there weren't any social workers left, and we needed to think about the genetic counsellors, whose numbers were increasing year on year and who needed to be acknowledged.
One of my first tasks in the AGNC was designing the logo. And it was a terrible logo, and I knew nothing about designing logos, but we put the N and the C overlapping each other as a kind of statement that the nurses and the counsellors were together in this sort of professional group.
As the newly named AGNC, we realised we had to carry on thinking about what was needed to develop this profession of genetic counsellors.
Was it more that you joined this much larger organisation that made you guys realise that?
I think we just, it was really because Heather was the chair. Actually.
First and foremost, I would have to salute Heather.
Heather Skirton.
Heather Skirton.
Heather.
Heather Skirton.
Remember Heather Skirton?
I mean, Heather seemed to be a dominant force.
I'm not great in confrontation. Heather was, really did all of that extremely well.
She was certainly someone that I looked up to.
With the support of the AGNC, we pulled together an education working group. This working group started setting up a registration process. This registration process would go on to set the standards for the profession.
We set up that education working group to provide a framework of, what did competence look like and what did you need to achieve it?
The work to do that, and Heather was, just decided this is time to do this.
We became, I think, a bit nervous in sort of mid-90s of, if we've got these, disparate groups and they're all working in regional centres, how do we make sure that people are protected, patients are protected? From like that 97 to about 2000, I think what we were doing was working on what are the competences that are needed for genetic nurses. By this time we were saying stroke counsellors. So we set up the working group.
I think a lot of people were not on board
But it was important because, this was really the early work on getting a structure and getting some sort of assessment process on whether somebody was safe and competent.
And I stood up at a AGNC meeting and announced that we were going to try and introduce this registration process. And someone in the audience was very upset and angry about this, and basically told me I should get a life and stop thinking about this sort of professional development. And I do remember feeling quite attacked and hurt at the time. I remember saying, I have got a life. I've got a husband, 5 children and 2 cats.
I felt very fortunate to come into genetics at that time when everything was just moving along, and to be a part of the registration system, such a huge deal.
I'm not sure the year 1999 or 2000 when we went to a London hotel. We worked all through the evening and then had some supper. We were called out onto the pavement in the middle of the night because there was a fire alarm. We were all standing there in our jammies. And then the next day we worked till the end of the day, and in that sort of 36 hours
we wrote the registration.
The registration process. Yeah. Basically, you've got entry by nurses, you've got entry by genetic counsellors. They need to have at least 2 years experience and then submit a portfolio of evidence.
And when I think now about what a huge piece of work a portfolio is to put together for most people, and how complicated it is and how extensive.
The AGNC at the time did their road shows and came round to the different departments. I didn't even really know what the AGNC was then, but came to talk to us about about professional registration. We hadn't a clue what was going on.
I had some very uncomfortable road shows. There was a lot of, resistance. Some people that didn't just quite fit into the peg. They could see that it was going to be a bit more difficult for them.
And there was all this sort of mutterings about, why do we need to do this? This is all a load of nonsense. This sounds like an awful lot of work. And
it was extra work. That's not easily accepted. It took a bit of selling.
I remember thinking, no, but this is about keeping us together, and we have to demonstrate our skills, and this is a real opportunity.
I think the more people that became registered, then they would encourage the people round about them to become registered. And it's a registration system that has lasted the test of time.
The basic registration process is still the same.
Our standards are high and they have been upheld over a long time.
One of the really significant things at the same time as getting the genetic counsel registration was also the title genetic counselor. That was the first time that meant the professional title genetic counselor. So that felt really significant.
Professional registration is no longer nurse, it's genetic counsellor. And that was hard for a lot of the nurses in the group, I think.
Because people were coming in from different backgrounds with different experience perhaps in the NHS, and they were coming in on different pay scales. So individuals were being paid differently for doing the same job. A small group of genetic counsellors in one hospital developed their own career structure and worked with the hospital to get them all on the same pay scale.
I think that the nurse versus non-nurse dichotomy, I suppose, took a long time to kind of address and resolve.
Birmingham at that time, there were a good handful of us that had come out of master's routes. It was still quite a nursing entry genetic counselling team.
There was a lot of angst about, lots of different routes of entry into the profession.
Being sort of, one of 5 master's trained genetic counsellors amongst a sea of nurses, and feeling very different.
And at Guy's, where I worked all my professional genetic counselling life, we did some very good work looking at a sort of salary and career structure. The newly qualified MSc graduates were not nurses primarily, and so they had a career structure that nationally was very, very different. And a group of my colleagues at Guy's decided that this was not equitable. And that was when the different banding came in, and the acknowledgement that there were different levels of seniority that you could work your way through. So I was involved in that, and I think that was very important, not just because I think it made pay more equitable, which I think it did, but it was the beginning of looking at what you had to do to progress through the career structure.
By chance, the NHS was also reviewing all the pay scales for non-medically qualified healthcare professionals.
As a profession, we had to benchmark ourselves against catering staff in the NHS, physiotherapists and nurses. And we needed to really get our act together very, very quickly as a profession to identify where our knowledge, skills and framework sat compared to other NHS professionals.
And because this early work had been done, the profession of genetic counselling was able to be embedded in the pay scale structure for the NHS. In 2003, the government was recognising the growing importance of genetic technology and produced a white paper. Genetic counsellors were mentioned as an emerging profession.
Genetics started to really come into the awareness of the Department of Health.
The green paper about Our Inheritance, Our Future, which then became a white paper.
Penny Gilbert, who was a very quiet but extremely wise person who was way ahead of her time in thinking through how genetic counselling was going to go.
It's important to think about the fact that it wasn't only in our practice. All those things were going on in parallel in terms of technology, both within genetics, within prenatal work. I think that I realised very early on that we couldn't exist in isolation. We had to fit in to the health service frameworks.
Because the registration mechanism had just been set up, and I'm sure that was really important in the genetic counsellors getting a mention in the white paper.
We'd really arrived. We were at the seat of strategic thinking.
One of the most thrilling things that's happened to me outside of my family is getting a little white card in the post one day which had number 10 Downing Street written on it, and being invited to have breakfast with the Prime Minister. And this was for the launch of the white paper. And I walked up that staircase with the Prime Minister's pictures up the staircase, and I thought, what's this kid from Melbourne doing here? It was incredible.
Quite a lot of money then was available just for departments to hire lots more people.
After that, I was able to secure 3 new posts in our department.
So suddenly our graduates had choices of jobs. And then the concern was we don't have enough people trained. The mention in the white paper of needing more training, we then seized on that.
If they could fund some training posts that would be 2-year training posts with proper mentorship and a proper training program and proper learning outcomes, all documented, and at the end of the 2 years they would be fit for registration. And it worked.
There were about 50 people, most of whom are still in practice now, who were trained through that scheme.
After trying several sort of training posts and being unsuccessful, I finally managed to land one. So this was the sort of original Department of Health training scheme, and it gave me all this sort of everything I needed to build my career from then on.
By the mid-2000s, we now have a registration board, we have educational programmes, we have role definitions, we have an agreed title, and we have a pay structure. But we do not yet have the title genetic counsellor recognised in British law. The Statutory Regulation Working Group of the AGNC prepared a submission to make an application for statutory recognition of genetic counselling as a profession.
Joint Committee on Genetic Counsellor Regulation.
Something like that. Yeah, I can't remember.
The prime reason for its existence was to look at what was going to happen about regulation. Something needed to happen. And it was just how to organise that.
It was part of the Genetic Counsellor Statutory Regulation Group, which I then chaired and led.
The other person, I suppose, that stands out is Georgina Hall, through all her work in trying to achieve statutory regulation.
A huge amount of work of Georgina Hall, having the kind of focus and meticulous attention.
She was a tower of force, sort of taking that forward and sticking with it for so many years.
That application for statutory regulation was our opportunity as a growing professional group to measure ourselves against standards that were developed by the Health Professions Council. We needed to show that we were evidence-based. We'd had to present in a very large public meeting, and we were particularly, I remember, emphasising the responsibility that we have as genetic counsellors to the patients, and they gave us the response on the day, didn't they? We'd met the criteria and that we had presented a sufficient case.
You know, when you look back over the paperwork and see that the HPC actually saw that we were self-regulating and saw that we had a disciplinary process in place, etc., we can be justifiably proud of what, 6 nurses come genetic counsellors sat in a room and devised.
In it, so if you have to say, well, what is the most important development in that time? And I think the answer to that, for me, is statutory regulation. That what we're doing is ensuring a system whereby patients are treated safely. In a way, that's what everything has been leading up to.
Yeah, and I remember somewhere in London, and we all had a big photograph taken outside, and I was like, "Hooray, we've got through!"
And then the next year, the coalition government came and changed everything. So it never happened.
And I was like, "Oh no, we haven't."
The 2010 general election brought in a new coalition government, which had a different approach to the regulation of health professionals, and there were no new health professionals to be regulated.
We weren't disheartened by what was going on. We managed to remain motivated, I think. We had an opportunity to meet with the Council for Healthcare Regulatory Excellence.
Yes.
So one of my skills along this is to remember all the acronyms.
The only route open to us was for the GCRB to apply to a new body, the Professional Standards Authority, to have their register accepted as a quality assured voluntary register. This was a whole new application process, so we had to pick ourselves up and start again.
One of the pivotal moments, getting the GCRB under the umbrella of the Professional Standards Authority, the PSA, and holding that certificate, to get that stamp that, you as a register of genetic counsellors meet that was a really key achievement for all of us, genetic counsellors that had all met a particular standard, which was really advocating for that patient safety element.
From 2012 in the UK, there has been another government focus on genetics and genomics. One of the initiatives has been establishing a new training programme as part of the Clinical Scientist Training Programme. This is a training programme for genetic counsellors though. These are funded training places through the NHS. The graduates of this programme are registered as clinical scientists.
We started to lose the white paper funding and the training posts that we'd had through that white paper, and needed to introduce a different sort of training. When the STP training programme came in, that really felt like things had taken just a slightly different direction. As AGNC chair at that time and being quite involved with that STP training, it felt like a really positive move. It felt really interesting in terms of our allegiance with science as well as with counselling. Since then, we've now started to think about apprenticeships and entering clinical scientists in genomic counselling through that route, another different way to try and get more genetic counsellors into the profession.
We are so rich and diverse as a profession. People have come from all kinds of backgrounds.
One of the great joys of working in the profession has been the amount of talent that we've attracted in.
When I reflect on the last 20 or 30 years, I'm very proud of the achievements we have made. We now have routes that are clearer for people who are interested in the profession of genetic counselling to become genetic counsellors. And we now have standards and systems so that they are safe and competent practitioners.
I think there was an incredibly strong, cohesive group that drove the development.
So much of the development of our profession has been, on my observation, it's been willing people who've been giving it a good go.
The sense of friendship and camaraderie and all working together for the same thing was enormous. But I think that sense of camaraderie really helped the work. People were willing to do a lot of things out of their normal work time because there was this sense of commitment to the group.
It's been such a team effort though, hasn't it? Our kind of shared passion for our work and our profession has just been amazing, really.
It's about a group of people who are so committed and had the vision to see what we needed to do to improve things and to go about implementing
that.
To be involved in the early development of a profession has been, it's been a hugely pleasurable part of my life, and I feel very privileged to have done that, really.
On a more personal note, it has been tremendously exciting to be part of developing a new health profession alongside the developments in genetics and genomics. Of course, this wasn't just me, and it wasn't just the people that have told some of their stories in this film. It was a whole group of people working together to make change, to push the boundaries and develop the profession of genetic counselling.